Can I just say what's happening? We had a very engaging parallel session this morning, and two members of the Go Lab who are supposed to keep people to time are not keeping them to time. So they are trying to hash them in, so we are starting a few minutes late. So apologies for that. We'll try to make adjustment, and we will shorten a little bit the next session. But we're going to start in 2 minutes. Okay. I suggest we make a start. There will be some noise because there is still a room that has to trickle in. I'm Airoldi, the director of the Go Lab. I want to welcome you to the second day of the conference. We had this round table. This is the first plenary of the day. We have a really busy day. Traditionally, the way we organize this conference, we have, as I said, academics and practitioners together. The first day focuses a lot on what have we learned, what is the new research, in an engaged way. And usually the second day has more of the practice side. So what should happen, what should we do different on Monday? So we've heard yesterday insight and we engage in conversation. It's not that you divide that practice from academia, but there was a focus, a very reflective focus. And I hope that challenged you. I talked over dinner with a few people who thought, oh gosh, that was challenging, and some of the sessions seemed a bit like harsh and negative. Maybe because it's an academic institution, and academics like a bit of challenge. This is when you have something stirring inside you, and you say, I disagree with that. That's when your view of the world is being formed and sharpened. So if this happened to you yesterday, this is a success. Today we have, as I said, quite a packed agenda. I want to warn you, then we go to the happy side, that there is a coffee break after this session, but it's not a real coffee break because you have 10 minutes, which we are running 10 minutes late. So the coffee break will consist of you walking through the hall, picking up some coffee, and going to your next session. So you can prepare psychologically. So the session today is about different instruments. We talk about social impact bonds, but social impact bonds don't come in a vacuum. And so today I'm joined by experts on the use of impact bonds and private and public partnerships. And we want to do some comparison. So we have this provocative title. Is an impact bond just a PPP where you pay for a social outcome, or there is something different? I think this interest came, when I joined the Go Lab at the beginning, and the UK government said, oh, we want to understand this instrument, impact bonds. I was a bit baffled because they said, oh, impact bonds is this instrument when we partner with the private sector, this is a social investor, and we pay for social outcomes. And it's a completely new instrument. And my feeling was, why complicating things? Why, you can try to do, why don't you start from something you know how to do, PPP, and you adjust social outcomes. So why don't you do impact bonds in infrastructure project? So you know how to do it, and you just, this little movement, and when you know how it works, you go on social projects and education where you don't have any infrastructure. But the UK government has always been ambitious, and so historically we made big jumps, and I had to accept it was this big change, and it was a double change. But still, the question remains for me, what's the difference of an impact bond? We're talking to procurement in local authorities, and they've been procuring contracts with the private sector for many, many years. What is different? So I'm joined today by Professor Stephane Saussier, who is a professor of economics, is from the Sorbonne school in Paris, at the business school, and he also leads the center on PPPs. So a lot of expertise there. We have Inga Afanasieva from the World Bank. She has worked, you will see the detail of a very rich career in Inga, but she's responsible for the impact bond and infrastructure project at the World Bank. And she has also worked in government, where she led a reform in education for the Moldovan government in her previous life. And we have Salim Bensmail, who, as you will see in the list, he works for John Laing Group. So it's an investor group, but he has 20 years experience as a senior civil servant leading PPPs and infrastructure project for the French government. He works at the Treasury, works for the city of Paris, before moving over to the dark side, as one would say, jokingly. But there is a lot of expertise here. Oh, you do? Well, I'm a school of government. I'm bound to say that. So My plan is to engage them with some question, but I want to leave time at the end for your question because we have a lot of expertise here. So I'll start with Stephane. And that's my question. Do you think that impact bonds are just PPPs with the social outcomes? There's nothing really new under the sky besides this little thing.
Thank you very much for this easy question, just to start with. Maybe I should start by saying that I'm not an expert of social impact bonds. So I was struggling yesterday to understand the difference between SEEB, DEEB, LEEB, and plenty of acronyms, and I'm not sure I really understand the differences. I also understood yesterday that we were talking mainly about issues that are common with PPPs. So we were talking about contractual incompleteness. We were talking about the difficulties to contract on social objectives, to find the right incentives. We were talking about perverse incentives. We were talking about the problems to monitor the contracts. That is exactly what we are talking about when we are talking about public-private partnerships. So what are the differences now, I would say? So I would say that from my understanding, when we are talking about PPPs, we are talking about project with infrastructure. When we are talking about social impact bonds, usually we are talking about small projects, small amounts, and no infrastructures, short-term contract. Yesterday I remember about the speech given by Emily. She was saying that on average, the average amount of investment in social impact bond was $3 million, and the total of investment made throughout the world since the beginning of social impact bonds is less than $400 million. So it's very few money compared to PPPs, and it's mainly because there is no infrastructures. We are talking about service contracts, if I understood well. So this is the first big difference. The second big difference is that usually, if I understood well, in a social impact bond, you've got a service provider that is public, and in the PPPs, very often, you've got a private company that is providing the service. And maybe the last difference I would like to focus on is that, to my knowledge, but I know that Salim knows more about this compared to me, and to my knowledge, because this is not public, it is not easy to have the information, you've got very few PPPs with social outcome. You've got plenty of PPPs with KPIs that are mainly technical KPIs, but usually you do not introduce social income in the PPPs for many reasons. And I believe it might change because, as you know, PPPs has been under attack for many reasons. And one reason, not the only one, is that PPPs and social objectives are antagonists. You cannot have good PPPs and respect social rights and social objectives and so on. And I believe that we might see, and we are starting to see, new PPPs with social outcome. So
can you give an example?
So yes, this example, for example, a few months ago, a public bank came and see us at the Sorbonne Business School because they believe they put in place the biggest social impact bond in the world until now. And they wanted us to study it and to evaluate it. So this is a very interesting case. This is a public bank. They raised 200 million euros in order to respond to a call for tenders from the French government in order to develop social housing and to welcome around 8,000 people, homeless people and migrants in France. So they want to provide housing and social services within the same contract. And in fact, this public bank contract, so they raised 200 million euros coming from long-term investors and the Council of Europe Bank. Those investors contract with the public bank. You've got a service provider that is a semi-public company that is providing the social housing and the social housing for all those people. And the capital, the investors are paid depending on social outcomes that are basic social outcomes, basic targets. So this is exactly what we were talking about yesterday during the last session. The main issue is what are the outcomes, how do you measure it? And does it change the behavior of those people that are providing the service? So in this very, I would say, so the name of the project is Hemisphere. So is this Hemisphere 1.0 project? You've got 4 basic social outcomes that are just the fact that you put child at school, the fact that you find a home for those people, a permanent home and not an emergency one, The fact that you open access to social rights to those people and the speed you succeed in this, and the fact that you organize or you build a personal project with them in order to have an individualized support for those people. So what is interesting here is that you've got something that looks like PPP. You've got infrastructures, you've got long-term contracting. That looks like a social impact bond from my point of view. Clearly, you've got social outcomes. What is interesting also to note is that investors are not at risk, and this is important, but this is not, if I understood well, and when I read the Brookings report, for example, on the seeds all over the world, this is not an obligation to put capital at risk to be a social impact bond, to be qualified like this. So basically, investors, their rate of returns is between, let's say, 1.5% and 5%, depending on the fact that they reach the social outcomes. So if they don't reach the social outcomes, their rate of return is 1.5%. So this is they do not put the capital at risk. And until now, it works. Not so bad. We are just in the phase of evaluating the project, but of course you might improve it.
Can I ask you something? Because a lot of the discussion yesterday, the one I attended, was on the frustration or the difficulty of managing these incomplete contracts.
Yeah.
But that's not new. Like, any contract is incomplete. So you have a PPP contract. Is that a complete contract?
A PPP contract is always incomplete. You've got this huge discussion between academics, knowing if we could be able to write a complete contract. So you've got this incentive theory framework, Jean Tirole, and so on, pushing for more complete contract, and you've got those people, transaction cost theory, Oliver Williamson, Oliver Hart in complete contract theory. All those guys are Nobel Prize, and they are just saying that basically every contract is incomplete. So you should start from the beginning, thinking about renegotiation and about how to make it evolve and adapt and so on. But the real true question in the specific case of Hemisphere and the specific case of PPPs with social outcome is the one we raised yesterday night during the round table. I mean, if your objective is to give love to children, what will be your outcome measure? I mean, what will be your target? How will you contract on this? Are you better not contracting at all on this? Or would you like to find a proxy, and what would be the result? Maybe you would have some unexpected results. The only thing I disagree a little bit yesterday with the round table, from what I understood, is that if you decide not to put a performance indicator at all, because what you want is love for children, you do not resolve the problem, because we'll have some people with no incentives, meaning that you've got two bad solutions, and you just choose the one that is not too bad compared to the other.
Thank you. So, not sure if this is like encouraging, but I think we have a lot of experience to rely upon in the PPP world on like how do you manage this incompleteness.
Of course.
So it's not something new. Inga, can I come to you? And we've seen an example from France, but the World Bank is very active in this space. What's happening?
Well, I'd like to say it's very active. I don't know if it is that active. I see a lot of other stakeholders here doing a fair share of their work. And maybe one of my missions going forward today at the bank with the impact bonds will be to crack this code. How do you measure giving love to children in an impact bond? And I might have a small solution there, or looking at one. So at the World Bank, some of you will know a couple of years ago, we've made it a prerogative. It's called Maximizing Finance for Development, where we're trying to raise as much funding outside of the official development aid, and that is bringing in as much as possible private sector participation, both through capital and expertise. And this approach, called the Cascade, just in a nutshell, means that whenever we're looking at a project, at solving a solution, the first question we ask ourselves, are there commercial private sector solutions to it? And if not, then what are some of the upstream reforms that need to take place in order to allow for this private capital to come in and solve that problem? And then the next question would be, well, if the risk is still high, then what are some of the guarantees and risk-sharing instruments that could be employed in order to mitigate for that? And only when everything else fails, we're looking at official public funding to come in and perform and take on the risk and perform the job. So this has been the approach even before the cascade was officially introduced as the mantra at the World Bank, and primarily used in infrastructure. And the bigger question now is, how do you translate some of that to social sectors? And this is a more delicate and a more complex mission for us. And what we've been doing in my team is looking at that. And the reason is that for the last 15 years, my team, and it was way well before I joined them, has been doing results-based financing across sectors, all type of results-based financing instruments. Primarily, we looked at infrastructure. Most of the portfolio is in infrastructure. We have about 50 projects in 30 countries, all implemented through the World Bank. And then a couple of them in social sectors. And with impact bonds, this new approach we've adopted a couple of years ago, also at the time we started thinking about changing the name from Global Partnership to Global Partnership for Output-Based Aid, which the name suggests, a keen focus on outputs. We've changed just recently to Global Partnership for Results-Based Approaches, which basically enlarges the field in which we're acting and also gives us a lot of flexibility of picking up the right instrument for the right problem. So impact bonds came into our portfolio a couple of years ago, started mainly looking at it and trying to educate ourselves, and then now more into creating a pipeline and looking at mobilizing an outcomes fund at the World Bank that would use the impact bond approaches. And then I think you asked, okay, what's happening at the World Bank? And I don't know, I don't know if it's time to go into the example, because that might be a little bit of a peek into how to measure love you give to children, right?
I would love to hear that.
Yes. Well, it's funny you mentioned this, because the first impact bond that I started working on is in early childhood education, and it's in Uzbekistan. And the reason we got involved in it is you have a setting in which fewer than a third of the children of preschool age are in preschool. And we all know, for obvious reasons, why early childhood education is important. And the country embarked on this mission of providing universal access to early childhood education, but the resources of public sector are limited. So they've allowed for private sector provision, which was a new thing for Uzbekistan. So in the last year or so, you have these new preschools, privately operated, emerging here and there. And they're doing this through a PPP arrangement between the public operator and the government. At the same time, the government has no means of controlling or verifying the quality of the education that those children receive. So in the PPP arrangement, the government side, the public side, is providing the infrastructure, and it comes in various forms. It's either land on which to build a preschool or an older building that is refurbished and turned into a preschool. And then the private side is educating the children and giving the country these smart kids. So the social impact bond will come in and will bring investments into these preschools that will go towards teacher training, refurbishment of preschools, improving the learning environments. And the government then will measure achievement of certain outputs and outcomes. And here's a conversation that can we truly only focus on outcomes. And then payments would be made based on achievement of those results. Two of them are easy, and that is occupancy rate, ensuring that these preschools enroll at full capacity. Another one is enrollment of children from disadvantaged backgrounds. It's something that the government is requiring as part of the PPP, but it's very difficult for them to measure because they don't have the system. And the third one is improved learning environments. So we're not measuring or paying against improved child performance or development, but we'll be measuring and paying against improved learning environments. And there are standardized tools out there that look at certain things that happen in the classroom, in the school, and this would be the likes of teacher-child interaction. It's an imperfect measurement, but it is the closest you can get to love giving to the kid. Looking at how the schedule is organized, how the day is broken down into activities, interactions. And that is measured, and this is the closest proxy you can get to an outcome for these preschools. And this is one of the impact bonds that the World Bank is financing, and then we're working on a pipeline of those.
We'll come back, I'm sure, from the audience, a quick question on this metric. Salim, 20 years of experience as a PPP infrastructure expert, and here the impact bonds. When you heard about it, how did you feel? Was it anything new? You were like, oh gosh, this is a new name to an old stuff?
Well, like Stephane, my background isn't in impact bonds, so I started looking at this to prepare for this session, actually. And what struck me was how familiar some of the concepts, the themes, the debates sounded to me with my background in PPPs, concessions, and more broadly, public management of public services. If you start with PPPs, I think it's important to remember just the revolution that PPPs brought to the world of public procurement of infrastructure. They were a completely different mindset, and they were based on the idea that public authorities needed to shift from a focus on the actual delivery of an asset to thinking about the long-term performance and the level of services that are provided on a long-term basis by those assets. So that was, I don't know if, nowadays PPPs are almost commonplace, they're hotly debated, sometimes very controversial, but when that was introduced in the world of public management, it was actually quite a revolution. So this, and this is something that PPPs have in common with impact bonds, is this focus on results, this focus on performance. Now, what is new, what seems to me very revolutionary and interesting about impact bonds is that the impact bonds take the focus on performance all the way to looking at the actual, delivering the actual socioeconomic outcomes that are the end game for public policy. And I think that is something that's very interesting. As Stephane mentioned previously, it's fair to say that PPPs have historically shied away from getting involved with the actual socioeconomic outcomes of the policies that the infrastructure that the PPPs are delivering are actually involved in. But that's changing. This is something that we see at the firm that I've been working for about a year now. John Laing, we've developed, we invest in infrastructure and PPPs and renewable energy across the world. And the projects that we're most excited about, for example, are projects where, in areas where actually I've seen some literature about impact bonds. For example, prisons. We've developed 2 prisons in Australia and New Zealand, where part of the remuneration that the private sector is getting is based on achieving specified levels of reoffending rates, beating national averages in terms of reduction of reoffending rates. Now that's something that's very interesting. It drives, it's led the consortiums who are at the private side of the contract to think completely differently about how the prison is designed. It's led them to, led us to bring together skill sets and capabilities from around the world to actually deliver a solution to the problem that was raised by the public authority who's procuring this. So, and we've seen this in other areas. We bid, did not win, but we bid for a project in New Zealand for a road where part of the remuneration was based on the ability to reduce fatalities and the number of accidents. Now, I come from France, from the country of highway concessions. This is not the way we think about procuring roads in many jurisdictions, and that's very innovative. And we found this very interesting. And so I really believe that this is, at least, PPPs are quite controversial, but I think that if they have a future, and I certainly think that they're a valuable tool, if they're used well and focused on the right projects, I think that future will lie in bringing in more focus on social outcomes, because there's probably more that the private sector can do for delivering outcomes, social outcomes, than what we're doing now. And so we believe that this is part of the answer to some of the controversies around PPPs. And I'd like to add one point. It's also something that the people who work for us want to do, because we're working with a new generation of people who want their jobs to have meaning, to have a purpose. They don't just want to make returns for shareholders. And when you get people involved in these kind of projects, then they are really they give the best, and that's the sort of projects they want to work on.
Can I challenge you, and maybe also Inga, on you talk about bringing different skills and capabilities to the table to create these partnerships. One of the narratives that I've heard about the importance of involving these new actors is that they bring new skills, and you align the incentive, and they bring good performance management. And this is why, if you align the incentive, we might see better results at the end. So there is this like win-win description. But often the starting point is there is insufficient capacity to be good commissioners for outcome in the public sector. We are not very good at managing our provider, so let's bring in an investor who will be good at managing the provider. What makes us think that government then will be good at managing the investor? Like often the provider is a charity organization, and you have social investors who might work for meaning, but they are not easier than the providers to be managed. So you've been on both sides. What are the skills that we need to cultivate?
Well, first, I think my first reaction to your question is, and probably this is the former civil servant speaking, I think this debate about the skills, about the private sector, the investors having skills that maybe the public sector doesn't have, is often an unfair debate. I think it's often the problem is not the skills that in the public sector. It's the environment in which public managers are having to conduct projects which are much more complex, sometimes less efficient than the environments in which the private sector is able to deliver projects. So it's not the skills. I mean, the people in the public sector are just as smart, just as intelligent. Sometimes, more often than not, they've gone to the same schools as people in the private sector. It's just that they're facing a completely different regulatory, legal environment. If you just look at public procurement legislation, I mean, people criticize the public sector for being inefficient in public procurement and the way it procures and delivers infrastructure projects. But public procurement legislation was never designed to be efficient. It was designed for with a whole other range of objectives in mind. Fostering the access of SMEs to public procurement, sometimes employment policy, social policy, environmental policies. But public procurement legislation wasn't designed to be efficient. So sorry, that's a cri du cœur, as we say in French, that I wanted to start with. Now clearly, if you move to an outcome-based procurement environment, then it takes a completely different mindset and probably also some slightly different skills. I think we've had this debate repeatedly in the French context, where we have a concept in French that actually I've been told does not translate into any language, which is maîtrise d'ouvrage. And maîtrise d'ouvrage is, at the end of the day, the overall responsibility for delivering a project. And that has been historically taken to mean having the technical skills to design the project, to at least oversee the design of the project, and taking responsibility for defining the right technical solution, and then having the responsibility for overseeing the delivery of it. that's technical maîtrise d'ouvrage. But if you move to outcome-based contracting, you need to forget all about that, and you need to become a strategic maître d'ouvrage. It's strategic maîtrise d'ouvrage, your ability to define objectives, to measure performance, to be clear about formulating exactly the service that you want, rather than define the technical features of an infrastructure, focus on exactly what services you want. Now that's a very different set of capabilities that you need to develop. And we're struggling with that, because I think the key message is any of these solutions where you outsource to the private sector, you need a very strong public sector. It's not the answer. Often the debate is framed in terms, well, the public sector is weak, so let's outsource to the private sector. No, the more you outsource to the private sector, the more the private sector, the more the public sector needs to be strong. But it needs to be strong around a different set of capabilities.
How does it translate in a different government setting, like in any low-income country?
So, first of all, when we're talking about these settings, we're talking, again, just as Salim said, it's more about the public spending efficiency rather than just transferring it all and privatizing the delivery of services. Right? It's the ultimate purpose is not to just take things off the public sector, off their hands, and have the private sector run everything. It's about spending efficiency and about being smart where's the best fit for whom. Obviously, the World Bank clients are low and middle income countries, and these are very smart and very. So we're dealing with governments and people in governments who are extremely smart, very knowledgeable about their context, but sometimes limited by the system, and that could be the procurement system and others, in how they can operate and deliver these projects. In 2012, the World Bank introduced a new lending instrument. From 2, we now have 3 lending instruments. The third one is a results-based financing instrument, Program for Results. We were very concerned at the beginning because country systems were not ready to adopt it and start borrowing from the World Bank and be paid once the results are achieved. And that came with a lot of need of capacity building inside the governments and in adjusting country systems in such a way that they are ready to deliver results-based financing. The other aspect I want to touch upon, there is a little bit of an uneven playing field between the investor and the public sector, and we'll have to be honest about it. When we have these private investors who have been doing commercial deals day in, day out, coming to negotiate at the same table with public sector specialists, representatives of the government, who work at a different pace, in a different setting, there is a little bit of an uneven playing field, and I think that we should all be more cognizant of this. And my job and our job at the World Bank is to ensure that the public side is winning in every single case, in the sense that they do get the best possible deal out of a results-based financing approach.
Thank you. I'll stop here to give time to the audience to ask questions. I'll collect 3 or 4 questions at a time. We have a microphone. Francisca, can you come on this side, in the front? And then the gentleman at the back and the third row.
Hi, my name is Steve Wright. I'm an independent consultant. This differential that's in the title, one thing that's worth bearing in mind, I think, is that SIBs, to my knowledge, are not bonds at all. So why do we use this name? It's a complete misnomer. And I think it takes us into posing that question where it's not necessary. Many PPPs have a social outcome buried in them. Not the UK system of PFI, that's just, can I do a piece of real estate? But many others, the health sector is one I'm most familiar with, do have meeting or exceeding regulatory standards buried within their specifications, and those are effectively, if you like, a social outcome. The differential that was posed between some PPPs essentially are capital intensive, whereas SIBs tend to be just service intensive. Yes and no, because there are many PPPs recognised in other parts of the world which are effectively just service outcomes. I mean, Gavi for that vaccine, for example, it's a public-private partnership. It doesn't have much capital embedded into it. So that's, again, with respect, a false distinction. I mean, I think what we need to recognise here is both of them waddle, both of them quack, they're both ducks. You know, they're really the same thing. And trying to pose that as a distinction, I think is just wrong.
Okay, thank you for the contribution. On the third row, and then at the back.
Yes, I felt I had to respond on the points that Salim was making. My name is Malcolm Harbour. I was member of the European Parliament for 15 years, and I chaired the Internal Market Committee when we did the whole of the 2014 reform. So from a legislator's point of view, the idea is to provide a framework where the public sector can maximise the opportunities in the marketplace and bring in people who will deliver the best possible outcomes and have the flexibility to look for areas more than just price. And that was what the whole idea of the 2014 reform was. I am now, I retired 5 years ago, but I'm now an evangelist for more innovative public procurement because I don't feel that the legislators' objectives are still really understood by the users. In other words, there's a lot of unexploited potential. And in that context, I was just interested in your headline here because Salim was the only person to mention the word concessions. And a part of the 2014 package was an entirely new framework for concessions. And surely if you want an analogy here, actually concessions in terms of an open-ended rolling contract relationship with the supplier, which will respond to changes in the circumstances and allow specific performance objectives to be built in terms of rewards. I mean, that's much closer in terms of an analogy than to a public-private partnership.
Thank you. Do you have a comment?
Yeah, if I may, I think the example of concessions. I mean, I think I certainly agree that concessions are probably the best, the most similar instrument to impact bonds, and I do think that there's quite a bit. Again, this is from France, based on the French experience, but the French experience of délégation de service public, which was a precursor of the concept of concession. France has been doing this for 150 years, and what's very interesting is that this goes very far into privatizing the delivery of public services when you really think about it, but it enjoys widespread support across the political spectrum. It's actually not a controversial field in France, which is strange because it actually privatizes public services much more than PFI. Or PPP type structures. And I think the reason for that is that it is underpinned by a legal framework which is largely built out of the jurisprudence of the Conseil d'État, but it's a very balanced jurisprudence that maintains the effective control of public authorities over the execution of the contract and the delivery of the public service, and finds the right balance with protecting the financial interests of the public sector, because under this jurisprudence, French public authorities can unilaterally step into the contract. If they are not happy with the way the service is being delivered, they don't need to renegotiate. They can just send a letter saying, "I've changed the contract. This is the new contract." This is legal in France. And the only condition is, if that has any financial consequences on the private partner, they need to be fully compensated. But we don't need to wait for a complicated renegotiation. And I think the fact that there's this balanced legal framework has made everybody very comfortable with the fact that you're putting users and the users of public services in the hands of the private sector. And this is something that's being done without too many problems across the water sector, social services, daycare for children, after school, cultural and sporting activities, across a very wide range of sectors. And the key here is maintaining effective control. That is the key to the political sustainability of the model.
Thank you. We have two questions at the back there.
Okay. Tim Gray, I'm a consultant as well. I wanted to pose a hypothesis to you and see what you think. So I was intrigued by the idea of the French infrastructure, which is providing social housing and measuring outcomes as as a result. I wonder if one were to try and take that further, if you were to pose to the sort of organisation that does public-private partnerships, and you were to ask them to build a prison, and they would, and a proportion of what they get paid for building and running that prison depends on the level of reoffending of the people who are in that prison. So they've got to think about that in terms of the design of the prison, how people would relate to each other, the regime that they set up to run that, you know, the programs that they put in and all the rest of it. You know, you could see that could be quite a positive thing to try and do. But do you think that the sorts of organisations who are in that market would be willing to take on that kind of risk, or is it a step too far out of their comfort zone and what they're used to be interested?
Well, I think the imaginary example that you've just described is exactly the PPP, the prison PPPs that I was mentioning and that we've developed in Australia and New Zealand. That's exactly that. Part of the remuneration is based on reoffending rates. I'm not saying it's the bulk of the remuneration is reoffending, because obviously there are quite factors that are beyond the control of what happens in the prison. But a significant remuneration premium is based on the reoffending rates, and it's actually led to a completely different approach to designing the prison, even physically. I mean, I've visited one of them. It's quite an incredible experience where you have actually inmates go through a sort of process during their time in the prison where they enter the toughest and higher security quarters of the prison, and then gradually, as their reinsertion process progresses, they go through different quarters of the prison, and the final stage, it really looks like a normal city with almost individual apartments and homes where they are largely autonomous in the way they manage their day, and it's very, very striking. This isn't the way typical French prisons in under PPP are designed, because you've just given the private sector a different range of objectives and incentives. Well, the private sector reacts to incentives and objectives, and they think differently if you provide different incentives.
Thank you.
Salim,
Yeah.
you know better than me the French market, but would you say the reverse, meaning that private companies are ready to invest in such projects, being paid partly on social outcome, but public authorities are really reluctant because this is a kind of innovation they are not used to? And
I think it's difficult for both sides. I'm not saying here that there's an army of private sector investors happy to take on all of these risks. I mean, at John Laing, our business model is taking on the riskier part of the infrastructure life cycle. We only invest in greenfield projects, so we're excited by these challenges. Obviously, we want returns to be commensurate with the risks that we're being asked to take, but we think this is what the active, independent equity investor is about, and we think that's a key player in the ecosystem of the infrastructure ecosystem. So, but still, I recognize that I don't want to suggest that it will be very easy to find private parties willing to do that, but there are a lot more than you think. And on the public side, it's obviously difficult because it means parting with what is the most intimate part of public policy. It's one thing to say, I'm not going to build the prison myself. It's another thing to say, I'm not actually going to run the day-to-day services in the prison. But to actually hand over responsibility for the direct handling of prisoners and their gradual reinsertion process, I think is something that is very difficult for public officials, not just for elected officials, but also for civil servants, because the reason we went into the civil service was often to be directly involved in these policies. So it's difficult for all sides.
Thank you. I'm afraid in the interest of time, you will have to ask your question while you grab the coffee. Do you want to give a last 30-second reflection based on the discussion and what you heard from other panelists?
Maybe just one conclusion from my side. When Salim said that the future of PPPs is probably to go for more social outcomes within the deal, I believe that it might work well for some infrastructures and social services, again, when you are able to measure social outputs and social production of the service. But I believe that it will be very difficult to introduce such objectives in some kind of public services through long-term contracts where it is so complicated to find a proxy of what you are looking at. And this proxy might change through time.
Big challenge. Inga?
I'm just very glad to see that results-based financing overall and impact bonds as one of the approaches is picking up in low and middle income countries. I think that there is a lot of opportunity for the private sector in these markets. It's an incredibly large, extensive market, and if there's a role that the World Bank can play in bringing that, would be great, and hopefully bring us closer to achieving the SDGs.
Salim?
No, I just hope I made a contribution to convincing people that there's a role in public service, in the delivery of public sectors and more broadly public infrastructure for highly motivated, active investors who are willing to take risks and get involved in projects.
Thank you. So can I suggest you grab your coffee, and the next session will start at 11:20. And can we thank the speaker for an engaging session?